Welcome to Rico 12. I'm Justin B., your host and a child of an all-powerful and perfectly loving God and an addict living in the miracle of recovery one day at a time. Rico 12 is an open to all addictions and afflictions organization dedicated to exploring the common threads of the differing manifestations of alcoholism, sharing tools and offering hope from those walking a similar path. We gather from diverse backgrounds, faiths, and locations to learn and support one another. Our speakers come from various fellowships and experiences, demonstrating the universal principles of recovery. Rico 12 is not allied or affiliated with any specific 12-step fellowship. This is Rico 12 speaker meeting number 353. Thank you for joining us live or on the recording later. Today's speaker is Shana C. She is a first-time guest speaker on Rico 12, and I am super grateful and excited to hear from her today. She'll be speaking today on the topic entitled The Intersection of Grief and Joy. And for me, it's very timely, and I'm grateful to have her speaking to us today. I look forward to hearing more about this message in a few minutes. But first, for a few quick announcements. Rico 12 offers a variety of recovery resources, including other podcasts and social media communities. To explore more, please visit our website at rico12.com. That's RECO12.com to check the chat and the show notes in the podcast for links. Rico 12 is self-supporting, and your contributions help us continue this mission. Thank you so much to all our spearhead donors, past and present, especially the last couple of weeks to Jesse, Lauren, Nigel, Michelle, and Melissa. Your support truly makes a difference. And anybody out there, financial or word of mouth, it doesn't matter. We're just grateful to have your support. If you'd like to contribute, visit www.rico12.com/support. I'll put the link in the chat and the show notes. For one-time or monthly donation options, every bit of support, like I said, financial or through word of mouth, helps us share these messages of recovery. Each week, we receive light and inspiration from our speakers. Their experience brings hope, meaning, worth, and growth to us as listeners. Now I'm going to welcome today's guest speaker, Shana C. Here's just a little bit about her before I turn the floor over to her. Shana is the wife of an addict, and she tried to carry it by herself when she didn't know any better. It wasn't until a cross-country move, COVID, and her husband's first relapse that brought her to an end of herself. That's when she found S-anon. It hasn't been a linear journey. She has had setbacks and challenges, but she keeps showing up, working a program, and learning to trust God one day at a time. Recovery has changed Shana's life and her relationships, giving her a sense of peace and freedom she didn't think possible. Today, Shana says that she can say without a doubt that she is a grateful S-anon. Shana, take it away. The floor is yours.
Oh, thanks, Justin. Thanks for having me. It's really a privilege to be here. I love the community that you're building here with Rico 12, and I just appreciate being able to have the opportunity to serve and to share a little bit about my story. Like I said when we were talking beforehand, taking some time to put my thoughts together really helps me see how God has been a part of my journey. And so even if nobody was here, going through that process has been very healing. So thank you for giving me a chance to do that. So as Justin mentioned, I'm the wife of an addict, and I've been in my own program, S-anon, since 2020. I want to start off by saying I wouldn't wish addiction on anyone. I know it's a pretty awful disease, but the discovery of my husband's addiction was really one of the best gifts that I've ever received. Now, at the time, it didn't feel like a gift. During it or for a while afterwards, it was the complete opposite, actually. But in hindsight, I can see it was the gift of disruption, the gift of disorientation, right? Something to get my attention, to turn my life around. And it turned into the gift of living. And that was a pivotal point for me. And that's changed the trajectory of my life into a way of living that I really never thought was possible. And it began by me doing something counterintuitive. Instead of being self-reliant, which is one of my biggest character defects, I surrendered. I admitted I was powerless. And I invited God into the mess that was me. And so over time, working my program, the suffering turned into freedom. And so that's what I want to share with you about today, is kind of that intersection of grief and joy in my recovery journey. Now, lately, as I've kind of prepared for this, I've had a few conversations about joy, and I want to acknowledge that the word joy may be hard for some people. And so, as I talk, maybe it would be helpful to replace it with the word peace or contentment, serenity, gratitude. Any of those might work for you if joy is a hard one. So let me share a little bit about who I used to be before the program. I was really enmeshed with my husband. If he was having a good day, I was having a good day. If he was having a bad day, well, then I would just try and fix it. I kind of felt like my sole purpose was to make him happy, but it was really in a selfish way when I look back. It was so that I could get the love that I wanted so badly, right? So if he was happy, then he could love me. I was highly opinionated, stubborn, and prideful. On top of that, I was very critical and condescending and belittling, just a great mix there. And I teased that I got an extra portion of judgmentalism kind of to deal with. I didn't like to be caught off guard or unprepared. Surprises were not good. That was being out of control. And so I really controlled my surroundings as much as possible, which meant I was focusing on everything and everyone around me instead of focusing on myself. I wasn't taking accountability for myself. If things didn't go the way I wanted, I could be very punishing, right? If my husband could just feel how wrong he was, then he would change to meet my needs. And when we'd argue, we'd have this very constant pattern, and that's I would attack to win. I was taught at a young age how to win an argument, and he would retreat and not respond. And so, I just took that as he didn't understand. And so I would need to share more so he would get it. Years ago in a counseling appointment, he said something that just pierced my heart. And he said once that he felt like he was always in trouble, but he didn't know why. My coping mechanisms and my character defects got in the way of developing deep and meaningful relationships. I pushed everyone away with my controlling, and I was causing harm to myself. My way of thinking meant I lived with this undercurrent. It was always there. Even if I wasn't exploding in frustration or anger, there was always this undercurrent of frustration, anger, and specifically resentment. There was so much resentment for people not meeting my needs. And if I stayed in a victim mentality, which, at the time, I didn't even know I was in a victim mentality, it meant I didn't have any responsibility and therefore didn't have to take action. I relied on my spouse to give me worth, to make me feel loved, to read my mind, and to supply all the things I needed. One of the readings we do in my fellowship is called the S-anon Problem, and I just want to read an excerpt for you. It says this: "We chose friends and partners who could not or would not love us and support us in healthy ways. We lived life from the standpoint of victims and perceived any personal criticism as a threat. For most of us, fear, anger, and depression were nearly constant." I remember the first time I heard that, I'm like, wow, they know me. They wrote that just for me. How did they know? My life was 100% unmanageable. I just didn't know it yet. For most of our marriage, I didn't know about my husband's addiction. He kept it secret. I could feel that there was this gap between us, but I had no idea that the reason was this addiction. For our 25th anniversary, we had planned a vow renewal, right? We had rented a venue. We had a big party list. People were traveling in. I got a dress. We got rings. There was going to be a video montage. We were on track just to have this stellar party until about 2 weeks beforehand, when I made a discovery that changed everything. The short of it is, I discovered that my husband was a sex addict. To say I was blindsided really isn't big enough of a word. He had kept it hidden for decades. And so, I felt like I had been gut punched. I fell off a cliff and was plowed over by a semi, kind of all wrapped in one. I was confused. I was in shock. I didn't know what happened. It affected his job, our faith community, our friends, our family. It was really pretty public. It was kind of like a bomb went off, and I was in the center, like looking around at the collateral damage. What just happened? It was very surreal. I considered myself a smart and insightful person, but yet I had been fooled for 2.5 decades. And so I felt a lot of shame. How could I not know? How could I not know? After I kicked him out, there's a lot of crying, a lot of Kleenex, and a lot of questions. And I didn't talk to him for almost 2 months. And I asked the question over and over, why me? Why me? Why is this happening? Why does this hurt so much? Why was I not enough? And as I came face to face with this new reality, it was really the most intense pain I'd ever felt. And so that's how it started, my journey with reality and my journey with grief. My sponsor has said repeatedly that recovery work is grief work. Recovery work is grief work. And I didn't necessarily understand what she meant at first. I just wanted it all to end. I wanted the pain to stop. Facing the reality now, grieving. It's what that means to me is being willing to look at all the lost things, the lost dreams. At one point, she suggested I make a list of all those things, of all the lost dreams. And so I did. And, it was pretty long. There was like one thing after another, after another. There was just a lot of hard. And I want to just share with you just a few things that were on that list. There were certain places, songs, and dates, that were now tainted. Of course, I grieved those things. Occasions like our anniversary were hard. I didn't want to celebrate. As Justin mentioned, we moved across country during COVID, and I felt really alone in a new state. I was disconnected from my friends in Florida, isolated. Everything was locked down, and that just amplified the grief. My kids, they didn't know about his addiction till later, but in those early days, my heart was just crushed to see them so confused and hurting. They didn't know what had happened to their parents that seemed to have it all together. I grieved who my husband wasn't. I had wanted him to be my protector and my source of everything. Basically, I wanted him to be my God. But I had to come to terms that he wasn't those things, and he couldn't be. So I grieved who I thought he was and who he wasn't. There were times that, I'd be flipping through pictures or something would pop up on one of my socials of an old picture. And I'd ask the question, was any of this real? Was our whole marriage fake? And so I grieved the dream, the lost dream of what I thought our marriage was. At some point, I started working my own program. And after a little bit of it, I had realized that my husband's sobriety, he was working his own program, but it wasn't enough to fill me up. Just because he was sober didn't make me happy. And so I needed to take responsibility for myself. And again, I began to work my own program. When I got to step 4, I did a very un-Shana thing. My thing, checklists. If efficiency were a love language, that would be my primary love language. And I just dove in to step 4 and just took a ton of time. It was like a year and a half in step 4. And being able to kind of mull that over and chew on it, so to speak, the blinders came off. And I needed that much time to see what my part was, what was my side of the street, how my words and judgment, they had inflicted so much pain and really pushed the people away, the ones I wanted to be close. So I could see my way of doing things was causing harm. And so I grieved who I thought I was and who I really was. Then there were times I thought, man, if I had only found programs sooner, right? What if? Kind of thinking like my time was better than God's timing. So I grieved the lost time and what could have been. And then, when I look at my relationship with God, there was grief there too. When I got down to it, when I was really honest, what I said about God and how I lived were very contradictory. I said I trusted him, but I lived in fear and worry. I said he was my center, but I would react before seeking out his counsel. I said I followed his will, but then, I held tightly onto my own plans. So I grieved the actuality of how little I trusted him and the disconnect in my life. Recovery work is grief work. And during that time, it felt like the pain and grief just touched every area of my life all the time. Like I couldn't get away from it. The pain felt permanent and pervasive. And my questions changed then from why me? Why did this happen? To when does it get better? When will this pain end? It was really hard for me to imagine my life on the other side of grief. And I heard someone describe it, kind of a season like that, as a dark night of the soul. It's a time when we know nothing. We're at the end of ourselves, where our grief is all consuming. But that's when the presence of the sacred, the God of our understanding, quietly wells up and mingles with our pain, connecting us to him, the author of love and healing. I just love that description of how dark times can connect us to God. In program, I've heard this phrase, pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. And, looking back at this season, I can see I was suffering because I didn't yet have the tools to not suffer. I don't know about all fellowships, but in mine, we don't really talk about that period of time very often. And there's this concept I ran across called liminal space. All right. So liminal space is a place of transition. It's like a threshold between 2 points. It signals the end of one time and the beginning of another time. It's an in-between. It's like if you're walking through a doorway and you have your foot in one room and the other foot in the other room, you're not really in either place. And that's where I was during this time. My eyes had been open to the reality around me, and I knew I needed help. And I was going to program. I had a sponsor. I went to meetings. I was reading the literature. But the 12 steps hadn't sunk in yet. I was in this liminal space, the space between knowing something, between knowing it and being able to live it out. And that was okay. That was part of the process. But as painful as that time period was looking back, I can say for me, it was actually a needed time of incredible growth and needed change. And so that's what the pain and grief did for me, was to bring me to a place of being so uncomfortable. I was finally willing to release, to let go of what I held on so tightly. As they say in AA, some of us have tried to hold on to our old ideas, but the results were nil until we let go absolutely. Okay, so what about joy? Well, that list was a lot longer. And so, at first, joy felt elusive, joy felt hopeless, joy felt impossible. In our program, at the end of our meetings, we read something called the Gifts of the S-anon program. And I just want to read just a little snippet for you, because there was a line that was really hard for me. I'm going to start just a little bit into it. Our ability to give and receive love will expand tremendously, and we will become increasingly available for loving relationships with others. And then there was this line that I couldn't even read, that I would get so choked up at. We will recover the feeling of joy.
Got questions about addiction, recovery, or just life in general? Let's noodle it out together. Grab your big book, a pen, a highlighter, and a notepad, and join Nikki M. and me, Justin B. on Rico 12 Noodle It Out with Nikki M. Each episode, we take real-life questions, ours, yours, and those from the recovery community, and dig deep into the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous to find real, practical solutions. So, if you're ready to do the work and apply the solution, tune in to Noodle It Out with Nikki M, streaming now on your favorite podcast platform.
I didn't believe joy was possible. And honestly, if I had to rely on myself, it wouldn't be. But the good news is the joy doesn't come from me. It doesn't come from my willpower. I can't manufacture it. I can't conjure it up. Working my program over time, trusting the process, learning how to trust God, joy slowly found its way back into my life. In fact, I can remember the exact moment when I realized joy was possible. Funny enough, I found it in Hamilton, Ontario, of all places. And I actually have a picture of that moment, and I keep it close as a reminder. It reminds me that even impossible things are possible with our higher power. Grief and joy are different sides of the same coin. How is that? Well, they both connect me to higher power in deep, deep ways. Joy and gratitude points me to God, the author of all good things. But grief and God also go together. There is a phrase in my faith tradition that says God will give us beauty for our ashes. We can give him our ashes and he will give back the impossible, beauty. And that's what the beginning of my journey felt like, incinerated, burnt ash. You can't really do much with ash besides throw it out. It's fairly useless. But thankfully, that's not where my story ended. In fact, I'm experiencing more joy, more peace, more calm, more gratitude, more serenity than I have ever felt before. For me, the way to joy was to stop sidestepping the pain. So the way I think about it is this: if I hadn't experienced the depth of grief, then the mountaintop feeling of joy wouldn't be as rich, right? Joy is so much sweeter because of walking through the grief. And that's not something I used to know how to do. I would just avoid everything. But God is in both of them, the joy and the grief. It was a really amazing miracle that God turned the ash into something so unexpectedly beautiful. Now I can find joy in lots of places: sunsets, gardening, vulnerable conversations with my kids. I can find it in so many places because, again, it's not dependent on me. It's a byproduct of my relationship with higher power. And so I want to give you an example of a place I found joy recently. It's very normal. It's very bland. It's not like this mountaintop moment, but I think it kind of hits the point. A couple weeks ago, my husband came to me and it was dinner time, and he said, "Shana, man, there's something you said this morning that really irritated me, and it stuck with me all day." Now, my old self, the defenses would have come up. I would have armed myself, ready to legitimize my words, defend myself, put him in his place, let him know how things were. And that's not what happened. We had this conversation. He shared where he was at and his feelings and what he was going through. And I kind of shared where I was at and my feelings and what we were going through. And then we just had a great rest of our evening. It was natural, like breathing. I didn't have to think about it. And later, when I realized the difference between what just happened and how it probably would have been pre-recovery, I was filled to the brim with gratitude and joy, because there was a time that I just didn't think living could look like that, right? I was always frustrated and angry and irritable. But to be able to live in a place of calm and serenity in the midst of hard things, I didn't I didn't know that existed. And so really that's just one example of how I am just so grateful for how recovery has shaped me. I can look back and see how my questions have changed over time as I've worked my program. They started with the why me, why did this happen? And then they went to the when will this end? When will I be out of the pain? And now they're usually, not always, but usually along the lines of, what do you have for me today, God? What are you teaching me in this? And there are times I actually get a little excited to see how he's going to work things out. My prayers have changed from asking for certain outcomes to praying for strength and wisdom to carry out God's will. And, I don't always have it all together for sure. I'm still very much a work in progress. I'm never going to graduate from this program. But I don't feel like I'm in that liminal space anymore. This is a new way of living. And so, as I said at the beginning, the discovery of my husband's addiction has ended up being a gift, a gift, a gift of life. And I'm truly am a grateful S-anon because recovery has changed my life. So I'm going to wrap up with something my sponsor has said that, it just feels like it sums everything up. I say the serenity prayer multiple times a day at meetings. It's in the literature. Serenity is the goal, right? Serenity now. But this is what she said. She said, serenity is not the absence of pain. Serenity is the ability to walk through the pain with peace. I'm going to say that again. Serenity is not the absence of pain. Serenity is the ability to walk through the pain with peace. So whatever I face, the curveballs of life, a lost job, a bad diagnosis, financial troubles, relationship troubles, the pain of the hard things. With recovery and my higher power, I can walk through them with calm and peace and gratitude and maybe even a little joy. And that to me is the biggest miracle. So thanks for letting me share.
Shana, that was awesome. Thank you so much for your share. And I love that closing phrase. It's not serenity is not the absence of pain. It's the ability to walk through the pain with peace. And that's something that I hope to get better at as I continue to walk this path of recovery. So a reminder to our live audience here, if you have questions for Shana, please type them in the chat. If you would like to remain anonymous, in other words, if you wouldn't like me to read your first name, direct message me or put a note at the beginning of your question anonymous, please. And we'll get to those questions as we go along. I've written down a bunch of questions as you've been sharing, and I've got a couple for you here to get us started off with, Shana. Yeah, I loved the that you talked about the gift of your husband's addiction was a gift of disruption, of disorientation, of like taking the norm and exploding it into something new. Recently, in fact, it was just a couple of days ago, this phrase was brought to me through a meditation that I was doing. It is, if I want a better future, I need to disrupt the present. So talk to me a little bit more about this disruption, this disorientation that took the present that was a disaster and made it into a little bit to a better future.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I've heard it said before that we can't be comfortable and grow. Like those two things can't coexist together, which then means growth usually means pain. I'm a gardener, and one of the things for plants to grow is they have to have a little stress on them. And then they'll produce a flower, right? And then they go back to resting, and then they'll stress. And so there's this this pattern. So I don't think that we always have to be in a growth stage or uncomfortable all the time. But when I look back at kind of what happened, I said I was stubborn and opinionated. And I think God knew that I didn't need a 2x4 to find him. I needed like a steel I-beam. And that's what it was. It helped me get to the end of myself to realize I can't control any of this. I stayed in my house for a few weeks because I lived in a smaller town at that point. And I didn't want to have to answer people's questions in the produce section of the grocery store, and so everything was just shaken up and I didn't know what was what. I was completely disoriented. And that doesn't feel good, right? It is disorienting. It's scary. But it was a game changer in my life. And at that point, all I could do was just go with the flow, right? Go where God led me. And he brought people into my life that surrounded me and who weren't even close friends at the time. And people would reach out to me and they'd do things for me. And I just did not feel alone during that initial time. And I could, because of that, I could see God moving. Like, even though I was numb and in shock, and when you're numb, you don't really feel things. Like, people would ask me, what do you need? Well, I didn't know what I needed. I was in shock. But I could see through the people around me that God was still there and God was still moving. And I just needed to go with it. And so, yeah, that's the gift of disruption, the gift of disorientation. If we are willing, right, and have an open mind and are honest with ourselves, God can do amazing things with that. And I think I'll be drawing on that time in my life for a very long time. About the growth that's come out of that.
Beautiful. Thank you, Shana. Now I have a two-part question that'll be followed up with a follow-up question. Okay. First off, how long was it between D-Day, the discovery day of this, and when your husband entered the 12-step rooms? And the second part of that, how long was it between D-Day and when you entered the 12-step rooms?
Yeah, so my husband is on today, and I'm so glad to have his support. What I didn't tell you guys is we stayed married. It was very hard, and there were long season of I just asked the question, should I stay or should I go? All the time. And I'm so happy I stayed because I wasn't in my right mind, right? I was dealing with my own insanity. And my sponsor once said, hey, before you make a decision, work through the 12 steps. Well, I told you how long it took me to get through step 4. So I'm glad I didn't leave. It was harder to stay, but we've been married 31 years, and I'm so thankful. So he had actually started recovery before discovery on my part. And he would say, I think that he was dipping his toe in the water. And so because discovery was so public, I think what he said before is, for an addict of his type, like, the worst fear is for it to be brought out into the light. And so the only reason I really stayed with him is because after we did meet, after however many weeks it was, I could see he was different. And it's because he was working the steps. And so I said, well, okay, well, we'll see. And he was just different. He was humble. He was gentle. He was kind. He was thoughtful. He wasn't selfish. And I'm like, wait, what's going on here? And his recovery kind of seemed up and to the right. We had a great community at the time. There was a lot of healing. And so he was working his steps, and we moved across country kind of after about a year. He had a relapse at about 18 months. So we'd been living now in a new place for about 6 months. And that's when I realized I can't do this by myself. Like, his sobriety, I need something for me. And so for me, it was 18 months after discovery that I came into the rooms of S-anon.
Hey, Spearheads, if you're looking to dive deeper into the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous with people who live the solution, then you won't want to miss Rico 12 Big Book Roundtable. Join David G., Nikki M., and me, the moderator Justin B., 3 recovered addicts from multiple fellowships, as we break down the big book line by line. In each 30-minute episode, we share our experience, strength, and hope in a real, raw, and practical roundtable discussion. So, if you are ready to learn and apply what you learn, tune in to Rico 12 Big Book Roundtable on your favorite podcast platform. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Now, the follow-up question to that is, were you initially, hey, this is his problem, not mine. He needs to work on it. And when did that change, if it did?
Yeah, I've heard that a lot in the S-anon rooms. So after D-Day, and we kind of got through that initial 6 months, he moved out, he lived with a sponsor, and then we worked through the disclosure and impacts process. He moved back in. And honestly, I'm going to tell you, that felt kind of like a honeymoon period. Like we were both these new people and there was a lot of hope. So, I came to S-anon not because I wanted to fix my husband. I've heard that a lot in the rooms. Now, I didn't necessarily think I was the problem, right? But I came because I needed help. This is not the type of addiction that you can talk about easily with people. Like, I've met people and they go, hey, I go to AA, and everyone cheers for them. They're like, good for you. But when you tell somebody your husband's a sex addict, it's a whole can of worms, and people can go down all sorts of roads. And so I didn't feel like I had people I could talk to about it. And when I entered the S-anon rooms, I didn't have to explain myself. I found people that shared this common problem, and I was just there for myself. And it was one of the best things I've ever done for myself.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for sharing that. And I think, well, I can only speak for my own experience with my wife, but I don't know how common that is that people go into an anon room just for themselves and not like, I'm going to fix my loved one, whatever that looks like. And this is how I'm going to do that. So thank you for sharing that. A question came in from our live audience. This is from Claire. Claire says, I'm just starting step 4 in S-anon, but don't know where to start. Can you give an example of how you did that?
Sure. I mean, there's so many ways to do step 4. And what I couldn't do was how the big book lines it out. I'm not saying that's wrong, but for me at the time, the big book lays it out in the way that you're dealing with your resentments. Well, resentment was huge for me, and it was too hard to face. I'm also a structure person. And so I needed something to walk through. And so I used the Al-Anon book, Blueprint for Progress. It was a spiral bound workbook. It goes through, I think, 25 or 30 different characteristics with really deep, meaningful questions. And then I would walk through them with my sponsor. So I kind of did step 4 and 5 simultaneously. There's a place in the back of the book where you can write kind of the key points from every characteristic. And taking that long with it, for some people that might not be good. And I will say there was a time it was really hard to deal with all that for a long period of time. So there can be some benefit for sure in doing it quickly. But it really helped me be able to connect the dots with my family of origin, with my coping mechanisms, with my pain. And it really helped me to see that, if I'm honest, I'm really no different than my husband. He was addicted, he had powerless over lust. I was addicted to him, and I was powerless over him. And so those two things are really the same. And so walking through that with somebody, I couldn't have done it unless I had my sponsor. There was some heavy lifting to be done. And so that's what I did. Now, when I walk with my sponsees through it, I give them a choice. Do we do Al-Anon, or in S-anon in particular, we have a blue book that's the 12 steps, and it has a few questions at the back of each. So I definitely benefited from having more of a structure to walk through it.
Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that, Shana. There's something here that I think you've already touched on a little bit, but I want to go into it a little bit deeper. Well, shoot, I just lost the question I was looking at here. Anyways, you talked about, going through it slow, going through step 4 slow, going through step 4 quickly, the benefits, the hard things. And you mentioned, I ran into a point in the middle during that point that just about, it was difficult. Mm-hmm. Talk to me a little bit more about the benefits of a long, thorough, and searching step 4 versus, hey, let's get through this quick and start moving to the next stuff?
Well, I haven't done it quickly, so I can't speak to that. But so the long part of it was I was really just trying to do things differently, right? My way of thinking had gotten me into so much trouble. So I was inviting my higher power into it and said, okay, what do you want from me? I'm really just going to try and take baby steps and not rush it. At the time, I also had a friend in program. We had very similar stories. We connected very deeply, but I began to see her use the 12 steps as a checklist. She's no longer in program. I won't speak to that, but I will say I knew for me watching that, like I didn't want that. And so I spent a lot of time in it. Some of the drawbacks were, my husband said at one point, I've always been confident, overly confident, at times. And he said, Shana, I've never seen you be so unconfident. And that's because my eyes were really opened to, again, my part in things. I never thought I was wrong. I was always right. And, I needed to be right because my rightness was tied to my worthiness. Right. So if I was wrong, that meant I was bad and I had very little worth. That's the very short synopsis of that. And so learning how to not be right, learning that sometimes there isn't a right, that I just needed to kind of work through it and go slowly. That was really helpful for me. If I had to do it again, I don't think I would spend that much time in it. And I hope the next time I do step 4, I can do it a little bit quicker. I was just talking about how actually, now that I've processed so much of the resentment, I do want to go back and do it the way it's lined out in the big book. I think it'll be very helpful.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. You've mentioned it. Well, you just mentioned your rightness was connected to your worthiness. You've talked a lot about your faith, a little bit about your faith. It sounds like you've been a faith-based type person most of your life, if not all of it. How has your perception of and your relationship with higher power changed up to D-Day and since then until today?
Yeah. So I have been a faith person my whole life. I touched on it a little bit in my share, but I guess the way I would picture my relationship with higher power before all of this was, he was kind of over in a corner, and when I was in crisis, come on, pinch hit, come on out. And really, when I get down to brass tacks, my view of God was based on my father. And my dad was always there in the big things, but yet I could be in the same room and not really feel like I know him. He lectured at me a lot, his wisdom, but there was never any honesty or vulnerability or deep conversations. I didn't feel like I was known by my dad, and that transferred to my relationship with my higher power. And so the way I kind of describe it is, in a movie when you see somebody either about to punch, like they're in a fight, or they're about to hug, and they go to do it, and the other person was a hologram, and they just kind of disappear. That was my view on God. He was there, but not really. Right? How could I have a relationship with a higher power that I didn't trust? How could I have a relationship with a higher power that I didn't feel like knew me? And even though I was brought up in a faith, I didn't really have the tools. 12 Steps has been a catalyst for my faith journey because it's given me the how, right? In my faith journey, they might say, hey, you need to forgive people. Okay, sure, I know that. But again, knowing it and living it are two different things. And 12 Steps has filled in the blanks for me for a lot of things. I could have never have forgiven my husband. And that was a whole process by itself. I could have never forgiven him for the things he had done if I didn't have this new way of connecting with my higher power.
Hey, Rico 12 Spearheads. If our recovery resources have helped you, please consider a donation. Your financial support, as well as your word of mouth support, keeps Rico 12 running and reaching the man who is still sick. Donate today at rico12.com/support or check the show notes for PayPal and Venmo links. Every contribution helps carry the message. Thanks for being a Rico 12 spearhead. Yeah, and I love how you define that. And that takes me to a question that I had written down that I thought I wouldn't get to, but I think you brought right into it. That space between knowing and doing, knowing and actually acting it out. I think you called it it's a $5 liminal
Liminal.
space.
Yeah.
You're
Yep.
gonna
You're
have to
good.
define
Yeah.
that for me. I know what it means just from context,
Yeah.
but talk to me about that liminal space and how your experience is from going from the knowing to the doing looks.
Yeah, when I was in it, I don't think I knew I was in liminal space, right? That's definitely just a looking back at it, which again is why shares like these are so important because I can piece all those things together and I can look back. I think it's really healthy for me at times to look back because then I get to see how God's been faithful through all of it and how he's really been there and how he's really showed up and he's really got my best interest in mind. So I didn't really know I was in that space. And maybe I am now, maybe 10 years from now, I'll say the same thing, right? But for me, you're getting at the question of what's the difference between knowing something and living it out, right? Knowing it and experiencing it. I worked with people with their budgets for many years. And I mean, who here doesn't know we need to save for retirement, save for a new roof, a new car, whatever. We all know we need to save, but how many of us actually do it? And that's the same principle here. And so again, working my program every day, praying and meditate, which I admit I'm not so great at, reading literature, going to programs, being more consistent, talking to my sponsor. There was a time when calling my sponsor, I felt like was a burden, right? And so I wouldn't call. Now I talk to her every week. We text probably multiple times a week because I realize she can say no if she wants to, right? But it just took a while of reps. It's like being at the gym, right? You can't go lift the 250 pounds right at first. You have to do a lot of reps to get to that place of strength. And again, that's where 12 steps has been so powerful in my life because it gives me the tools, the way to do the reps. So that, like in that conversation with my husband, I've done enough reps now that it just feels natural. And I'm not in that liminal space, at least in that regards.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned a practice that you went through in working the steps of listing the things that you had lost in this. When disclosure happened, when you realized that you felt you'd been duped for 25 years, whatever that looks like. How so often I hear I just want things to go back to the way they were.
Yeah.
Have you experienced things going back to the way they were, or did they have to become something new?
Yeah, there was a time I wanted that, right? There's a time I wanted the pain to end. I just wanted to go back to the way things were because I was not aware. Ignorance is bliss. Um, Things have not gone back to the way they were. They're better. And, like I think I said at one point, there was this gap between my husband and I. The way I explained it when I talk about it a little more in detail is it's like pre-discovery. It's like there's a rope around his waist and he's moving away from me. And with all of my energy, I'm trying to pull him back to me, right? There's a gap. And what I wanted was connection. What I wanted was vulnerability and honesty and intimacy. But that wasn't possible because of his addiction. They say sex addiction is a type of intimacy disease. And so he really had to work his program. And there was a time I had to say, well, even if he doesn't work his program, I'm going to be a better person. But thankfully, he has worked his program. He's worked a strong program. And there were times I wanted to focus on the marriage. And my sponsor would repeatedly say, Shana, focus on yourself. Focus on yourself. You can't control. Focus on yourself. And it would frustrate me at times because I'm like, wait, no, he's doing this. Focus on yourself. Focus on yourself. And as I released that and began to focus on myself, and again, he's working his program, things have gotten so much better. I feel closer to him than I ever have, even when we were dating and it was all, romantic and, whatever. Um, and so I do just get excited about what the future holds. And there was a time I couldn't even think about the future because I was just trying to survive the moment. And I didn't know what the future would look like. But now, I am excited and, I pray he keeps working his program. Pray I keep working mine. And as we continue to do that and focus on ourselves, it's kind of like, I heard it's kind of like a pyramid, right? Like if I keep focusing on myself and he keeps focusing on himself and we focus on God, that we're going to become closer to each other as we move along that journey.
Yeah, I love that analogy, and I try and live it in my own life and in my own marriage too. Is we're trying to get closer to each other and closer to God as we move up that pathway. So, one of the close up questions I have here for you, Shana, the topic is the intersection of grief and joy. Uh, how how has this experience of finding joy in grief prepared you for whatever the next grief is that happens? As we know that life keeps on lifing, and grief will come again. How are you going to deal with that?
Well, grief is here now. I have aging parents. And probably in the last less than 2 years, my dad has had a tongue cancer surgery where he's almost died, and it has rapidly increased his dementia. He's now moved to a memory care facility just a few weeks ago. And dementia is an awful disease. You lose them by inches at a time. My mom fought breast cancer and had a mastectomy. Just a few months ago, she was diagnosed with a very aggressive form of leukemia. And there was a life expectancy given. And so right now, I feel like I'm walking through something called anticipatory grief, right? I kind of know what's coming. My parents aren't invincible. They're not going to live forever. And at the same time, I'm grieving the loss of my dad, who was, even though he influenced my view of God, I've been able to work through the resentments that I had for him. And I'm so glad I did that, because now I'm able to love him where he's at. He can't tell, he was a storyteller. Like he didn't really connect, but he would always tell these crazy stories. He was just such a great storyteller. And he's at a point where he doesn't remember them and he can't really tell them. And so one of the ways that I make living amends to him, because I pushed him away for a long time because he wasn't who I wanted him to be. The way that I'm making amends to him and my mom is to go down there more. They're about 8 hours away. To call him, even when it's uncomfortable, and to share his stories back with him, to remind him of the legacy that he's left or is leaving. And so there's this grief that's very much a part of my life. And some days I just feel like I need to cry, and I just cry. But I know that this grief is not going to be permanent and it's not going to be pervasive. And I can feel the joy. I was just down there a few weeks ago and I was able to sit across from him and just be in the moment, not be worrying about the future or angry about the past, just be in the moment with him, just soak it up. And just, even though I was sad, kind of at his state, I also felt this joy that I could be with him. And so again, that's how working my program has really helped me prepare for life and whatever life comes my way.
Beautiful. Yet another example of the miracles of practicing these principles in all our affairs and everything we do. What a beautiful thing. I love that. As we wrap up here, Shana, do you have any final words of wisdom for us?
Um, Gosh, keep working your program. And if you are going through grief right now, I would say there's a book that really helped me. It's an Al-Anon book. Here it is. It's called Opening Our Hearts, Transforming Our Losses. It's topical. It talks about grieving our childhood, our dreams, the death of a loved one, relationships, how grief is a spiritual transformation. It was key. It was key. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Shana. And to everybody out there listening, if you would like information on any of the materials or fellowships or anything that were mentioned in today's meeting, I will put those links in the show notes of the podcast. So you should be able to find those pretty easily if you just go into the show notes of the podcast. Thank you so much, Shana, for an amazing RICO 12 speaker meeting. You did a great job. You brought in experience, strength, and hope is where I feel at this point. Thank you so much. If anybody out there in the listening audience has any questions that we weren't able to get to, please consider joining our WhatsApp community or send an email to rico12pod@gmail.com. We'll get you in there. Or if you'd like to connect with Shana, if somebody emails me, can I forward that information to you?
Oh, absolutely. 100%.
Awesome. So to connect with Shana, send an email to rico12pod@gmail.com, and I'll be happy to connect you with Shana. If you haven't already done so, please consider rating and reviewing the podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It's a powerful way to work step 12 and share this recovery with others. Next Friday, I'm excited for our speaker. It's a RICO 12 favorite, Father Bill W. He's spoken on this podcast a few times, but he recently released a book on two-way prayer. That's his life's passion, is two-way prayer. And he'll be sharing a bit about that book and about two-way prayer, some of the things he's learned and wants to convey through this life's project. I look forward to hearing from him again next week. So stay tuned, stay updated, get on our email list, join the WhatsApp community, and we're happy to do that. So let's wrap this up with the third step prayer. Shana, are you willing to say that for us?
Oh, wow.
If not, I can do it.
Yeah, you say that, and then it immediately left my mind. So
Yep.
Why don't you lead, and I'll just follow along.
Okay, sounds good. God, I offer myself to thee, to build with me and do with me as thou wilt. Relieve me of the bondage of self, so that I may better do thy will. Take away my difficulties, so that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help of thy power, thy love, and thy way of life. May I do thy will always. Amen. All right, everybody. Remember, there is one who has all power. That one is God. May you find God now. Keep coming back, and when you do, come all the way in, sit all the way down. Let's trudge this road of happy destiny together. Work it. You are worth it.
Standing still a moment, carving out this time, reflecting on the landscape of this life of mine. Peaks too high to conquer, streams too wide to cross, troughs too deep to walk through without incurring loss. Yet here I am, still standing tall, despite the rough terrain. One like me survived the storms and walked through wind and rain. Still standing, I will fight the good fight, still searching for glimmers of light, feet still on the ground. I can still be found, standing still.
My wings are torn and tattered, but I know I still can fly. I may not soar unfettered, I may not rise too high.
Recorded in the book of life and bind it with the seal that